My guest today is Kevin Mahoney. Kevin is the founder and CEO of Illumint, a fee-only virtual financial planning advisory company focused specifically on millennials. The virtual part of Kevin's practice means that he generally interacts with clients at night over video chat so that, as Kevin describes it, planning consultations can happen after work deadlines, date nights, and bath time. Kevin specializes in helping clients in their late 20s and 30s navigate the key financial decisions that arise in early to mid-adulthood, from managing student loans to buying a house, to investing savings and planning their family finances to start a family. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us today to share insights and tips about family finances for couples and new parents.
Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
Good, good. I'd love to start just by learning a little bit more about your background. Can you tell us a little bit about how did you get into financial planning specifically on millennials and young families, and what made you choose this specialty?
Sure. My background professionally has always been finance, albeit in a couple of different industries. And I got to a point, both professionally and personally, where there seemed to be this opportunity to use some of my finance knowledge and skills to help people in a way that I didn't think they were receiving sufficient help up to this point. And it was specifically driven on the personal side by my wife and I preparing to have our first child, where even though I had this finance background, I have an MBA in finance in addition to the work experience, we were spending a lot of time researching these new questions, financial questions that were coming up that we had to decide for our family, what the best path forward would be. And I just kept thinking when I was going through it, if I'm spending this amount of time and having to figure out these questions and kind of navigate, some of these confusing articles or these unclear topics, like what must other people my age, like my friends who don't work in finance, what must they be going through when they, get to this point? And so I just saw this great opportunity for me to kind of fill that gap and take my interest, my own experience, and my background and apply it to financial advice in a way that truthfully, wasn't being done very much of the time and still isn't that common. And I've had, great success and I think meeting people where they're at in life, giving them the advice that they specifically need at this stage and not doing it in a shady way or in a way that's not transparent or, based on a certain amount of wealth or income. It's financial advice that's accessible for them at this point in time.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about, I wanted to focus mostly on family finances for new parents, would-be parents, but even preceding that, for couples who are contemplating marriage or newlyweds, maybe we should actually begin some of the financial discussion there. So money is one of the most common things that couples fight about and one of the main causes of divorce if you look at statistics. What is it about money specifically that causes this in your observation from, counseling clients?
Yeah, it's not just money itself, it's also the society and the culture that we live in. So most people will recognize that money is a very emotional subject. And that can be for multiple reasons. In some cases, people have grown up with a very complicated or challenging relationship with money, depending on how they were raised and what their parents did. And although we may not think about it on a day-to-day basis, that very much informs our own financial habits and how we view money and how we have those conversations with our partner. And then the second big element of it, I think at this point in life and in that relationship dynamic, is the aspect that money so often reflects our values. And so when you enter this relationship with someone who may have different spending values or just different financial values in general, if you don't see eye to eye on those things, and particularly if one partner is judgmental about the other partner's values, that can be upsetting or at least emotional in a number of different ways, because your partner's response to those financial decisions that you make, reflecting potentially who you are as a person in some ways, it can be really insulting depending on what they say and how they act based on some of those decisions that you make. So it's not easy coming into it based on those factors. But then you have this societal aspect where we are very poor in the United States about discussing money. And again, that starts, in our childhood, where a lot of times parents aren't very open about financial decisions with their kids. Kids are often in the dark. They rarely learn all of the things that they should be learning by the time they become an adult to make their own responsible financial decisions. And so we take those same lessons. We take what we've seen our parents do and other adults do, and that inevitably enters into our relationship. And so we may not be forthcoming about some of our financial fears or our financial mistakes. And we may be nervous about being honest, or we may question what the other person is doing, if they haven't said a certain amount of detail about, their financial habits. So it's really this dual challenge that couples face, that they have to navigate in order to have a strong financial relationship together.
So how should couples who maybe haven't had a lot of the hard conversations when it comes to finances yet, because when you're dating early stages, that I think often doesn't come into the picture yet, but when you start getting serious, then those things may start to come, or at least you may start to observe things. How can people sensitively suss out their partner's values in a way that's not judgmental, but still is acquiring the information that you need to understand if your values are compatible? And when it comes to money, perhaps what are the most important questions that couples who are becoming serious or even contemplating marriage should ask or be observing about their partner to understand this?
Yeah, there are a number of different levels to that conversation and kind of sharing that information within the relationship. And at the most basic level, I think it starts with the day-to-day things. And if you're the partner who's particularly interested in having those conversations, or you want to share, your own financial interests and questions, I think recognizing the responsibility that you have as part of, the partnership to be open and forthcoming about some of your own financial activities can really go a long way to, just making it a part of, perhaps not daily, but, weekly and monthly conversations. And then, and so I think those types of questions and conversations can, kind of just occur around the house or kind of as needed when they come up. But then for most of the other conversations, I like to suggest that people try to do it in a very relaxed, non-confrontational setting. So if, it's a nice summer night and you're out for a walk in the park, you're just chatting, maybe that's a good time to raise something, again, that's not, particularly stressful or confrontational, but just opens the dialogue. And there are any number of examples and places where those types of conversations can unfold. It could be at a wine bar, it could be, while you're killing time waiting for a train, like you name it. And in some of those conversations, I think they start to enter into like a deeper, perhaps more like philosophical element of finances, where you're asking about like, have you ever made any like big financial mistakes, or do you have any, regrets that you made, that you have related to, financial decisions that you've made? And that can start to open some doors to making sure that, all of those financial cobwebs kind of come out and are aired as part of the relationship before, you take the next level of commitment. And then I think the kind of highest level that you can go to, and probably the most helpful level for the relationship overall, is asking a lot of questions related to values, and some of those values that we talked about in the previous discussion, where you're asking things like, if you had unlimited funds and you weren't really concerned about, making your budget work this month or paying the rent, like what would you want to spend your money on? What do you most enjoy spending your money on a month-to-month basis? Like, what are those purchases that make you really excited and that you think about, for a long time after you've purchased them. Asking questions like, if you had 5 years left to live and it was going to be a healthy 5 years, like, what would you want your life to look like? How would money factor into that? And, for a lot of people, I think some of those questions are just like uncomfortable right off the bat. We're not used to having discussions like that. But when you give people the space to answer an open-ended question, like a really big open-ended question like that has a financial component, it'll start yielding responses that are enlightening, both just on the type of person that you are and what you hope your life to look like, but also how money plays a role in that. And it's less about being concerned about paying off this payment this month, but it's more like, this is what I want to save for. When we invest, this is what I want to spend the money on in 15 years, 20 years. I'd like to start a business. It can be so many different things, but that both opens some doors about what finances might look like currently and in the future, and also how the partnership is going to structure life together in the years ahead.
Are there I guess, what are the specific types of values that financial values that couples should be actively trying to understand about the other person, to make sure that these conversations don't get so open-ended or meandering that they don't actually yield like important information that each person should know about each other's financial values? So like, is there a way you think about, like, what are the like maybe values buckets or categories? Like, in my mind, I'm thinking like, maybe you want to know how the person thinks about debt and credit and student loans, or whatever the case may be, mortgages. I'm just making that up, but I was just curious, in a financial planning practice context, is there a framework or a checklist that you have found helpful for couples to try to gather this information?
So the reason I think, even though they're open-ended and may seem like they're not sufficiently tied to money, at least in the abstract context, I approach it from that way because it's often not the little things, the little expenses, or the day-to-day things that most impact our financial lives and our financial stability. It's the big stuff. And so when you have those conversations, you start talking about things like buying a house or owning a home compared to renting. And those are the bigger financial decisions that will really impact how much money you need, what that savings needs to look like, how much you'll be spending on that goal compared to some other goals. And I think the more like logistical aspects of it, like how much down payment is it going to require, like those things unfold over time and will change with time, depending on what people's earning potential looks like, how careers are moving, how the economy is moving, like the situation we're currently in. And so I think those logistical aspects are important when you get to that point. But I think when you're about to enter into a long-term relationship, it's arguably more insightful to understand what some of those big ticket items are for each person. Like saving up to launch a business is a very different use of money than saying, I want to travel abroad twice a year, or I want to live abroad for some period of time. Those are questions that I think shift the needle more on personal finances within the relationship than some of the day-to-day stuff that, while important, is less so in the overall context of the relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. A related question I'd love to get your thoughts on is there are there any red flags that you have seen, red flag signals or indicators that you've seen in your practice experience that couples should be aware of, because they likely indicate trouble down the road if you're observing it already now? And if so, what would be some examples that folks should keep in mind?
Sure. So I'm grateful that I have not worked with any clients where one partner has hid any significant financial information or kind of done anything destructive financially behind the other partner's back. So I can't speak to, I mean, I know that happens in some cases, but I can't speak to that specific set of circumstances. But I will say one thing that troubles me, and that's very important to me, and I think is important for the success of the relationship over the long term, both financially and just the relationship as a whole, is what I generally label as financial equality or financial equity within the relationship. So I really like to see when I'm having conversations with clients that both partners are equally engaged in the financial discussions. And sure, from an efficiency standpoint, it often makes sense for, hey, you take care of like the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month budget. I'll make sure our money goes into, the investment accounts that we have, and that, that asset allocation is appropriate based on what we discussed. But I think the relationships are much healthier and are more nimble and flexible over the long term from a financial standpoint if both people are at the table, engaged in the conversation, not just talking forth themselves, and getting into some of those value questions and asking questions. Oh, when you set up your investments before we were together, like, why did you do it this way? Having those back and forth discussions is the most valuable way to ensure that the couple maintains being on the same page financially and working toward those goals that they share in their relationship. It's when the conversation is really dominated by one partner and the other person is just kind of playing a very passive role or has no interest, that I think can spell trouble, if not in the near term, at some point down the line. Like, especially in a worst case scenario where someone gets seriously ill or passes away, and the other partner is left to fend for themselves with a lot of these issues. And if they haven't been engaged or haven't been involved, it can be really difficult for everyone involved.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it sounds like that's true, whether the lack of engagement is due to lack of interest, or whether it's due to like interest, but just lack of a parity in like financial education and savviness, where the other person just says, oh, I'll take care of that. It sounds like you mean it both ways. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it could be for any number of reasons. One that you didn't mention is even just confidence. Like, if the relationship started and one person was very, because there are some people who are very hands-on with their money. Perhaps they were well educated on finances when they were growing up, and they feel good about it. They pay attention on a weekly basis. And other people, it's intimidating. It makes them nervous. They feel like they don't know, and so they spend as little time on it as possible. As that relationship comes together, that one partner, is probably going to take the leading role on most of the stuff, if not everything. And that can work. I just don't think it's the most sustainable kind of like resistant model, that you could have for when those bumps come along the way, whether they're, external to the relationship and it's an economic situation, or something that happens within the relationship.
How do you nudge the person who is less engaged to become more engaged without being pedantic about it?
It's challenging. I think for just the couple, it's very, very important to make, if I'm the one who's more interested, or if I feel more educated, I think it's important for me to make sure that I'm soliciting those other person's opinions and questions, and not shutting them down and being like, hey, I got this, like, I know what I'm doing. So I think making sure that feels like an open dialogue within the relationship. And then for people who engage an advisor, in my role, I try to make sure that both partners are heard. And oftentimes I'll find that one is dominating the conversation or has all the questions, and that's great. I want to make sure those questions get answered, but I also want to turn the floor over to the other partner and be like, all right, how do you feel about that, or what questions do you have on this topic, so that it's hopefully equal time or equal opportunity for both people to express their concerns, their fears, their questions, and then hopefully that kind of opens it up to being more involved down the road.
Cool. So let's shift to new parents or young families. What are the biggest, maybe unexpected but important ways that a couple's finances change once they have a baby that enters the picture, besides the obvious that expenses will increase?
Yeah, I think everyone who's thought about this point in life will understand that childcare is often the biggest, although perhaps not unexpected. But then in the unexpected category, I'd probably say it's health insurance related. Um, it's very important for people who are preparing, to have their first child, to understand what their insurance includes and does not include, to pay attention to whether premiums may rise substantially depending on their family makeup, and then specific to like hospital stays before the baby arrives, while in labor and afterward, understanding who your different like caregivers are in that process, and are they in network, out of network. It's Everyone knows it's unnecessarily complex and difficult to navigate, but just taking the time to ask those questions, any provider that you're going to go see, are you in network to this insurance plan, calling your insurer and saying like, hey, here's here's our hospital plan for the birth, like, here's the lineup of people, are these people all covered, and if they're not, figuring out what your other options can be. I think that's probably one of the bigger surprises that can lead to higher costs, that people would just assume like, oh yeah, like this, these aspects of us having a child are all covered under our health insurance, and there are so many different pieces to that puzzle that may not actually be the case.
Gotcha. Anything beyond health insurance?
Not that I think is totally unexpected. I'd actually say more commonly it's the opposite, where people assume that they need to spend a lot of money on all these different things based on advertising they might see, or things that their friends have. But there are a lot of opportunities between, and I want to point out that this is specific to a particular demographic who has the resources and the network to have access to some of these things. But for gifts that are given as part of a baby shower, or friends who have already had kids, there are a lot of different opportunities to minimize your costs by getting things that are gently used, donated by a neighbor or a friend, asking family members to purchase certain things as part of a gift so that you don't have to. I think that's something that people often downplay or overlook. And even when they get to that, and perhaps it's helpful to think about that beforehand, because when you're in the moment and you're tired and you're stressed, it's certainly more difficult to think about those options. So kind of having a feel for, all right, here's where I can get some of these things, or hey, I should ask these people I know for help with this stuff before the baby arrives, I think can help to keep costs down to the extent possible, in preparation for that stuff you can't control in a lot of cases, like the childcare.
Got it. So I guess related to that, what are some of the what are some concrete actions that new or would-be parents can take in advance to best prepare themselves financially for starting a family, whether it's reaching out to their network or thinking about ways to reduce some of these costs? What are some of like important concrete actions that parents can take to prep themselves, and when should they ideally be taking each of these actions?
Sure. So one basic step, which we're actually all going through in some form or another right now, is just ensuring that you have sufficient savings or cash available, right? So like right now in this pandemic, people may have certain things they want to do with their money or plan to do with their money, whether it's investing more for retirement, paying off some student loans, some extra payments, let's say. But right now, an important and valuable thing to do is just hold on to that money, to the extent that there's no negative consequences in doing so, until we have more certainty and we understand a little bit better what the months and years ahead are going to look like. Similarly, I think when you're preparing for that phase in life where you have those new expenses, just being aware that, like, all right, instead of putting this, the money that we have that's a little bit extra and locking it away, into a retirement account or whatever, even like a 529 plan for college, these are all worthwhile goals, and they're not bad moves to make, but it's just making sure you can kind of navigate those new phases where you're still feeling your way through things and understanding what certain payments and costs are going to look like. So I think that's a very basic one. And even for people who want to invest, if that baby, the timing of the arrival is far enough down the road, there are some cases where it might be appropriate to invest that money in just a taxable account that you can access at any time when you need it. You don't want to put money in there that you absolutely need in 3 or 6 months, but if you're looking ahead a couple of years, even that's an option to kind of achieve the investment goal, but also have money available for when the baby is 6 months or a year, or you name it. And then related to what we were just talking about, I think becoming familiar with the resources that you have in your community or your network. A good example, in DC where I live, there's a Facebook group that's largely comprised of mothers, but there are a good number of fathers there too, that in theory started in one neighborhood, but is actually spread to a good portion of the city, where people post useful information for young parents to know, but they also really frequently say, like, hey, I have these extra diapers that we grew out of, or hey, my child got this gift from a grandparent for Christmas, never really played with it, we don't have the space for it, anyone can come pick it up at our doorstep this week. Things like that are invaluable in a number of different ways, because it can save you money. When you're talking about like toys, it can give your child a new form of entertainment that you don't have to really go out and look for, or fund the price of. And then similarly, planning ahead with family and friends who want to contribute in some way. Grandparents, in my experience, have great intentions and are often eager to do something nice for both the child and perhaps the parents, but that can often be in ways that the parents don't really want. And so being upfront and saying, like, hey, it would be really grateful for us if, like, you could make a diaper fund and we could buy diapers for or you just buy the diapers for us for a certain amount of time. There are a lot of useful ways in there to, again, get exactly what you need and not things that you don't, and minimize your costs in doing so. From a more like tactical finance perspective, a flexible spending account, I think, is an often underappreciated way to pay for a lot of things that a baby needs. A lot of the typical things like formula, breastfeeding supplies, these are all things that if you have an FSA, flexible spending account, through your employer, that's kind of a use it or lose it account. So you need to spend it typically by the end of the next tax year. You can go into CVS or similar stores and buy those things that you really need and are essential with that money that you've saved from your paycheck in the FSA account. So things like that, can't necessarily chip away at the biggest expenses, but they can help keep everything else under control.
Just for folks who maybe aren't yet knee deep in the Google research on planning for all the things they need to have ready for a new baby coming into the family, what are the big categories of expenses that new parents will suddenly find themselves dealing with once their newborn arrives, as you've seen?
We talked about childcare. I think diapers and, in some cases, formula can certainly add up. I think a lot of the other things that a crib is a good example. Like a new car seat is something that's very important for the safety of your child. But a crib that's in good condition can be taken from someone else, as long as it's all intact and all the pieces are there, without you having to spend a lot of money on something like that. So those first 3 or 4 items that I mentioned, are often very specific to each family and each new child that arrives. But keep in mind that a lot of those other expenses can be greatly reduced if you can find creative ways to get in touch with the people who no longer need them.
Any other tips or hacks for helping to reduce, some of the expenses that spike when a newborn arrives?
So on the child care front, it's not going to reduce the overall cost, but a dependent care FSA is a way to capture some tax benefits when you're putting away part of your paycheck, and then apply that money that you've saved toward child care. I also think for a very small percentage of the population, but I will bring it up just because I've had a number of clients who've been in this situation. Everyone knows daycare is not cheap, particularly in high cost cities where a lot of us live. For people who have a spare room in their house and are willing to have someone live with them, going the au pair route often is one of the least expensive ways to go, just because of kind of the like cost savings you theoretically get by providing housing for someone, providing some of the meal costs for someone. It's not for everyone. A lot of people aren't comfortable having that other person in their house, but I think it's worth raising for people who haven't thought about it. Like I can speak for myself. Like when my wife even just first floated the idea, like it felt like such a foreign concept to me. Like I didn't have a nanny or an au pair growing up, so I definitely balked initially at the idea. But when you look at the daycare costs, like it's really tough to swallow. So for a lot of people, they'll do whatever they can, whether it's a nanny share, splitting a nanny with another family or two that in the area, or going the au pair route, can be a strategy that some people aren't familiar with.
So did you guys do the au pair?
We did do it temporarily.
I see.
And overall we had a good experience. It can certainly be hit or miss depending on how the kind of relationship unfolds with the family and the au pair, but it also can have a lot of benefits. It's more flexibility, compared to like a strict daycare schedule. It offers more flexibility in many cases than that daycare schedule would allow.
Yeah, we thought about that as, oh, sorry, there was like maybe a little bit of a delay, but we thought about the same as well. And one of the things that, I don't know, we considered that the au pair relationship is like, it's usually 1 year, then the person rotates out. Maybe they can extend for a second year, but they often will want to go to a second location just to broaden their experience, I think. Was that your experience? And like the transitional issues where the child is like becoming attached, did you guys find that to be, or how did you guys find that?
Sure. So the programs we looked at, the au pairs are allowed to stay for 2 years. So if you get a new au pair who is not currently in the U.S., they can live with you for 2 years. And we found, being in D.C., that I think similar to your point, but being in a big city was appealing to a lot of the au pairs compared to being in further out locations. And then with we preferred the option where your parent could only stay with us for 1 year, but they also had a year of experience working in the US in this role. And I think for children at a young enough age, the transitional part we didn't find was detrimental in any way. They adjusted very quickly. I think they were young enough that it wasn't a huge shift for them. So that
Got
was our experience.
Gotcha. And then one thing I also recall, because again, my wife and I were considering this at the time, was that there's like strict hour limits. Like I think 35 or 40 hours, if I recall, depending on the agency. And you have to give the au pair like a continuous weekend break, or it's been a while since so please correct me if this was not your experience. And so there were definitely gaps where there would not be childcare because the au pair needs to have a break. And so I was just curious if that posed any challenges at all, or how you guys managed the schedule so that there would always be coverage.
The programs that we looked at, the au pairs are allowed to work 45 hours a week, and you're right, they need a day and a half consecutive off. So in theory, it doesn't have to be a weekend, but that's obviously the most common time for most people. So it's different for everyone's work situation. 45 hours is enough that for a lot of families, they could do a fairly typical Monday through Friday schedule and still be able to cover most or all of the workday. And then when I talked about that flexibility piece, if one of the parents has a more flexible work schedule, that's where, if there's a certain number of hours during the week that you don't need coverage for, you can shift it to the nighttime so that the parents can go out on a date night. Or, that's when you can just move hours around a little bit more. That won't apply to everyone, of course, but if one or both parents does have some flexibility to work from home, obviously things are a little bit different now than when we were looking at it. But that can free up hours to, help you with your adult lives and not just, taking care of the work hours.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So we talked about some of the categories of expenses that spike and maybe some of the ways that you can manage those expenses. All in, how much do you recommend couples have saved up by the time a newborn arrives, so that they're just well prepared and can focus on the kid and not be stressed out about money?
Yeah, I hope I don't disappoint you here, but I don't have a specific number for you here. It actually reminds me of a lot of what we read about saving for retirement, where you'll see you should have X amount saved by the time you reach age 35, or by the time you plan to retire at age 60 or 65, you need to have $1.2 million. Like, those numbers are nice in theory. In the context of retirement, they're based on a lot of assumptions that we have no control over and that they can kind of tweak as they see fit to hit that number. But in the context of saving for kids, there's only so much that people can do to save, on a monthly or annual basis. And at some point, I believe, like, I'm not trying to make this punitive for people and say, like, hey, you need to stop going to Starbucks so that you can have more on hand, like when your child arrives. That's not the way I prefer to approach budgeting and spending and saving in this case. So this kind of ties into what I was saying about, making sure you have enough cash on hand and perhaps holding on, to some money that you might otherwise be interested in putting different places. If you do plan to invest it, maybe it's better investing it in a taxable account that you can take out without a penalty compared to a retirement account. But other than that, I think it's more the more important way to look at it is just, what does your saving strategy overall look like? What does your own savings plan look like? And, can you improve that? Like, are you automating, your savings so that you don't have to do it manually at the end of the month, and instead it goes from, it hits your checking account after you get your paycheck, and then a day later it's moved, X amount is moved into your savings account? Or, once or twice a year, are you increasing your savings amount by a small percentage so that you don't really feel the pain of doing that, but at the same time, that percentage is incrementally going higher over time? I think if people are doing those things, then you'll have this savings bucket that, depending on how child costs unfold, maybe it it goes, into the emergency fund or stays as part of the emergency fund. Maybe there's enough left over that, more can be invested in your IRA like next year. I think the better way to approach it is just focus on how well you're doing at savings and making sure that you have it accessible to you in the time before the baby comes, and then kind of seeing how things go. Trying to keep costs under control to the extent possible. And then if you've done well and you have more, left over, then you put it out into, these other goals that you're working on.
Yeah, it makes sense at a high level. Are there any heuristics or rules of thumb that you advise clients, or it's really just very individual specific based on the things that you mentioned?
I think it's individually specific, and part of the reason I feel okay saying that, in addition to how I feel about just having a good saving strategy in place, is that kids aren't cheap, and a lot of people struggle to save in general, but they manage to make it work. Like somehow these kids arrive, people are really stressed about the costs before they come, and it may not be easy and things may be tight, but it becomes part of your your monthly spending. And I have kids who are in the toddler age now, and so our grocery bill is just higher than it was when it was the two of us, because they've added to what we eat each week. And so sure, our grocery costs have gone up, but it's just kind of flowed through our budget. And as we adjust each month or every 6 months based on what we're earning and what needs to go out the door, we just figure out where to tweak here and there to make it work. It's really just, I think, most important, in addition to that savings strategy piece, understanding what those big costs are that we've talked about, like having that, figuring out those childcare numbers and what that looks like. The more expensive purchases that you might have, like a car seat or ongoing diaper costs, whatever it might be. Just doing the math on that and kind of getting a sense for what the big ticket items are, and in the smaller stuff you'll figure out, and you'll to the extent you have savings, you can use it for that.
Do you recommend new parents buy life insurance?
Yes. Plain term life insurance does not need to be expensive. The most common mistake I see parents making is that we're all introduced, I think almost all of us are introduced to life insurance through our employer. So we fill out those HR forms when we start or when we go through open enrollment every year, and they'll offer you the life insurance option. Almost everyone checks the free option. That's a benefit. Some people will add on the additional amount, but that insurance doesn't stay with you if you leave your job. It's often more expensive than what you can get on your own just through the private market. And it's probably not enough for what you need. I find that a lot of families are surprised at exactly how much coverage they would need if they're trying to have funds available for the big goals that they're really trying to replace income. So, we're talking about like paying for college, paying off the mortgage, then any other like supplemental income that the, remaining partner might want to have. So, going online, there's a website that is called, I think it's lifehappens.org. Let me just confirm. Yeah, lifehappens.org. They have a good calculator that parents can use to determine what coverage amount they actually need. And then going online and just, looking for some quotes. And most parents will find that, they're only going to be spending $30, $40, $50, $60 a month probably at most on term life insurance that will cover, give them the exact coverage that they need, more or less, for those goals, that I just named, or anything else that might be important to them. So that's really all I think people need. And beyond that, their money is better off put toward other uses, like saving for retirement in a low cost index fund.
Are there any scenarios where whole life might make more appropriate sense for new parents? And if so, what are circumstances or facts that would tend toward that, I guess, direction?
I generally the answer is no. Term life insurance is just so much less expensive, and then the investment options, like life insurance shouldn't be viewed, especially at this age, as an investment. Get life insurance to replace the income that you need if something happens to one of the parents, and then invest on your own, either through your 401k or on your own through an IRA at a place like Vanguard, which offers low cost diversified index funds. You're better off for the long term, both probably from a return standpoint and from a cost standpoint, if you keep those two things separate, and get exactly what you need in both of those categories, than trying to buy a product that combines the two in unclear ways that won't work for almost everyone in this group.
Where does life insurance stack up in a household budget, in your view, compared to all the other expenses that new parents are prioritizing? You know, we've talked about how, you know, budgets are tight. When a kid enters the picture, it's even tighter. Where should life insurance rank compared to other, you know, expenses in the budget?
I think it's relatively low, especially if you think about a lot of the things we're willing to pay for, gladly, like I'm talking about a gym membership or, some of the fitness classes. I mean, I could go on and on, but um, it's not that expensive. It's not as expensive as I think a lot of people fear it will be. Um, and I think that's often because people hear those horror stories about the really expensive insurance that they were sold. If you're a teacher, oftentimes people come into the school and they get access to sell these products to teachers, or however else you may find your way into life insurance that's not term insurance. It doesn't have to be that expensive. And then beyond that, just looking at what you get for what you pay. I mean, we all know how much people want the best for their kids, and paying this relatively small amount to make sure that your children and your family is truly protected if something happens to you, it's a no-brainer. And it's just the type of thing that you need to make a high priority and fit into your budget.
Got it. Cool. Are there, I would love to also get your thoughts on what the specific tax benefits are that are available to new parents. And if you have any tips for new parents that they should keep in mind to maximize those benefits, whether it's timing, income, expenses, or deductions, or even trying to time the kid to come out before year's end, for example, managing your income levels, etc. Just help us understand what are the tax benefits available for kids and how to best utilize them.
Yeah, a lot of my advisor colleagues like to joke that tax decisions shouldn't drive, tax implications shouldn't drive a lot of the major decisions you make in life. It's important to keep them in mind, but I'm not going to suggest that anyone try to plan the arrival timing of their baby to help themselves on a tax front. I think we've talked about the big ones. The dependent care FSA, can certainly be helpful, using just the regular FSA component to buy a lot of those supplies, breastfeeding supplies, for example, that you'll need for your baby. And then one we haven't talked about is the 529 plan and the tax benefits that you can get when you want to save for college starting at a young age, because that's a question that I get a lot, and a lot of young parents are interested in doing. So feeling confident to go ahead and invest in that account, but just understanding, how you value college, how much you think you want to, what percentage you want to cover for your child, where the type of school you would like them to go to. Like, some of these decisions are, difficult to, or some of these assumptions are difficult to make when the baby is a newborn, but it can help to inform just like how much of your income you're putting into these accounts, and when you increase those levels or decrease those levels.
Got it. Cool. Well, listen, Kevin, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us. This was really interesting to hear about sort of the observations you've seen with new parents in your practice. Where can people find out more about you and your financial planning, practice and services?
Sure. So my company's website, company is Illumint. The website address is illumintfc.com. F for financial and C for community. Illumintfc.com. I write a monthly article for Forbes, so check me out there in their advisor section. And I have a podcast about housing decisions and how that plays into our personal finances and all these trade-offs that we've talked about today. And that is Rent Move Buy is the name of the podcast. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, you name it. Those are the big ones. And then, people are always welcome to reach out to me over email or whatever social media platform they prefer.
Great, wonderful. We'll make sure we link to all those things in the show notes. Thank you so much again. Look forward to sharing this with our audience, especially the new parents out there. And, I'm sure they'll get some good value out of this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.